Charlie,
My name is Jazz.
and today we are bringing to you a public live Q&A session on the topic of depression. In view of the current climate, mental health has really started to come into the forefront, and what we've decided to do as an organisation is to bring the opportunity to the general public to be able to increase their awareness and their knowledge around some really central topics with regards to mental well-being. Of course, today we are going to be looking at depression in particular. What that means is that for the next hour or so, and we will be doing this regularly in the weeks to come as well, we are going to be here to answer any and all of your burning questions with regards to the topics that we are discussing. But who are we? We are not academics. We are also not medically trained. But what we are people with lived experience, and what that means for us is that we are able to give kind of a different angle or insight, if you will, into the world of mental health. With regards to myself, I'm a wellbeing coach with Seropia. I'm also the wellbeing program coordinator, and what that means is that I have quite a bit of creative input into the stuff that we deliver, but I'm also on the front lines most days, helping members day in, day out to be able to better understand their mental wellbeing needs and to ultimately empower themselves to make some really meaningful changes.
And that's kind of what I do as well, to be fair. We do a very similar job and we talk a lot about our lived experience. And I think before we start going any further, I think it's really important that we mention this is a public live, so we've recently moved quite a lot of our lives onto the public access. You're more than welcome to comment and leave any questions or comments. We do have to make you aware we've now got a capacity to see who's commenting, and they will be available, so you will see comments on the side of our camera, so you'll see a chat relay. So just to be aware that if you comment, your comment might come up on our little chat relay and we can answer any questions.
Absolutely. And with regards to the way that we want to operate today, we do have kind of a little bit of a structure that we want to go through, but just to be clear, anything that you guys bring to the table is far more important to us. So to that end, anything that you want to comment, any questions that you may have, that you might want to contribute, we will pay attention to them and we will do our very, very best to go through those.
We've just had a comment. Hi Sylvia, hope you're very well. We can just see a comment there. Hello.
Hello.
Hope you're doing very well today.
Very nice to have you. Wonderful.
Ooh.
So, without further ado, shall we launch into that first question?
So we've got a bunch of questions that we got collected from Facebook, Instagram throughout the week. So we will start with this very good question, very good starter question. What does depression mean to you?
And this is a good point. I think with this first question, we're going to give a go at answering that question for ourselves, giving our own input. But if you want to answer this question for yourself and leave your comments, I think that would be invaluable as well. So what does depression mean to you? It is a very, very broad topic, is what it is, but kind of the first gut feeling that I get around depression is that pervading sense of low mood, that lack of drive, that lack of motivation, that lack of vitality sometimes that can keep even people that have been functioning really well up to a certain point, can start to present barriers and ultimately keep us locked into really small routines. I think that's kind of the direction that I would go with it.
Yeah, I when I was going through my recovery, so to speak, when I was going through my own journey, I thought depression was a mood that was so low that I didn't want to be here anymore. What I didn't realise is depression was so much more than that, and actually it didn't just affect my mood, it affected my practical life, my basic needs. When I was low, I slept more, I didn't have the motivation to leave the house, so my anxiety as a result then rose up. I struggled with loneliness and isolation, and it affected my finances because I wasn't able to work.
Yes.
It affected my housing because I wasn't able to keep my house in order, and my hygiene and things like this. So depression for me, it really is one of it's a catalyst of a lot of other well-being issues as well, isn't it?
That's absolutely true. I think you use the word catalyst. For me, it's like a pervading feeling that starts to affect so many different areas of your lives. I love that you touched on the finances. For me, finances were definitely a difficulty when I was depressed because, like I say, I wasn't working, but it started to affect my friendships, how I interacted with my family. But for me, this is a way that I would describe it. I lost my light at the end of the tunnel. It was that before I was feeling depressed, I always had this sense of I was moving towards a greater purpose. There was this very clear direction that I had. But all of a sudden, well, I say all of a sudden, over the course of a few years, the rug was pulled out from under my feet and I lacked that clarity. There is a description that I think I'd quite like to bring in now for how I had depression explained to me when I was first going through my experiences with it. If you imagine life as a beautiful white pristine sheet. It is perfect in every single way. It is silken to the touch. But on that white sheet, in the top corner, there is a black smudge. Depression can be compared to noticing that black smudge and putting all of your focus on it, to the exclusion of being able to see the rest of the beauty that's around you. And the way that I like to think about it is that when we're depressed, we can develop such tunnel vision that if we're just looking at that black smudge, we can't see the light, we can't see the hope, we can't see the other really nice things that are going on around us in our lives.
I compare it to a little bit like being a loud minority, in the fact that it's something that it's one element of our entire emotional makeup. We've got all types of different emotions, and low mood depression is one of them. However, it's so pervasive, and it's so what's the word? It's so kind of I'm trying to think of the right word for it. It's
all encompassing.
All encompassing. It kind of spreads out, and it feels so raw and so challenging that it then starts to as you said, goes into that tunnel vision, that thing of that's all I have, that's all I understand.
That's it. And consequently, our comfort zones can start to shrink as well, to the point where we're only operating on really, really small routines that we feel capable of carrying out. If I just reflect that onto myself, when I was really, really unwell with depression, I had a very limited number of things that I would do. A lot of it revolved around drug use, is what it did. Otherwise, it was just about playing computer games, watching meaningless rather, television, going to the shops. But that really was me as an entirety in a whole.
Yeah.
A few things that I would get to each day. It's good. So,
should we go on to the next question?
Let's have a look at the next question. So, we have...
This is a really interesting question. Why do some people call my depression low mood? So I've got a personal story with this one, and I think it's relevant in the sense of we go through this process where we're feeling low and persistently starting to get lower. And depression is a word that is used very, very quickly in terms of if you're low, if you're feeling low, you're depressed automatically. Depression, by its definition, is it has got the element of how low you're feeling, so the amount of the low for the intensity of those feelings, but a lot of it's to do with the length of time that those feelings persist. For example, if you've had a grief, if you've had a bereavement, and you're feeling low about that, you're having really low feelings, you're having depressive symptoms, it wouldn't necessarily in a way be depression unless it continued into something chronic and it started to spread over a vast amount of time, or it got very critically intense. And actually, in my experience, when I went through services and when I went through my journey, I felt that having my depression compared to low mood felt invalidating, because depression was more, in my head, more harmful, more intense, more acute than having low mood.
It warranted greater recognition from those around you.
And it kind of warranted the treatment.
Absolutely.
And the kind of this level, the kind of escalation in a way. And actually, in hindsight, personally, it's different for everybody. Everyone has their own journeys. In my thing, a lot of my stuff was low mood because I wasn't consistently depressed. I was for a while, but then it developed out into kind of anxiety and low mood. And I think that's just as valid, and I think it's so important that we say that if you're going through a bereavement, if you're going through a situational low mood, or if something's affected you in your day-to-day life, please feel that your low mood is just as valid as somebody with depression, because it's not about the time you've had it, it's just as much about what's causing it and having that support around that time, and that's just as valid, and it should be just as valid.
I completely agree with you on that, Jazz. If the way that I would go about answering this question as well, it really just kind of mimics what you're saying and adds a little bit perhaps, is that underneath depression, underneath low mood, there is a human emotion.
Absolutely.
The overwhelming one that we might recognise, the primary one, sadness.
Yeah.
And to that end, all depression, or a lot of depression, is low mood. And if you find yourself in a period of low mood for a long enough time, then you might be slapped with the label of depressed or something otherwise that's quite similar. Just to go with what you were saying about bereavement, for instance. If, just to give a personal example, imagine I were to leave this workshop today, or this live, and I were to get a call from Maria, the service manager. Charlie, you're sacked. I get home, I've been kicked out of my house. I get a call from my partner all on the same day. Charlie, we're finished. It would be very, very natural for me to have low mood. Very natural and understandable.
Yeah.
3 months later, you might still expect I wouldn't be right in myself. A year later, I might still not be right. But if it was 5 years later, that's when it's tipped over into depression. At that point, it is all about the quality of that emotion and the length of time for which it lasts.
It's the process as well, isn't it? Like, if there's, if it's still as acute as it was when the first, or intense as the first, the initial thing. So if, I think medically it's 6 months over to drop into anything chronic. And I think it's different for depression in general. But it's that length of intensity, and it's the recognition of how to get out of it as well. It doesn't mean that just because you recognise it, you don't have depression, or just because you don't recognise it that you do have depression, because it's very complicated. But in general, it's that length of the chronicness of it, and actually what steps have been made, what works, what doesn't, has anything worked?
What
really, treatment have you got for it?
What treatment as well? But this is exactly it. When we start to look at depression and low mood, what we will start to see is that there are very clear patterns between the two, and that actually in treating the both, a lot of the time it's the same kind of motions that we need to be going through. And that's something that we're going to be paying particular attention to as we go through.
It's a very good question.
It's a very good question. Just before we crack on with the next question, I do want to mention, for anybody who's joining us today, if there's anything that you want to mention, anything that you want to bring to the table, if you're feeling comfortable with it, please do, because we are very, very happy to go with that.
Give your feedback to the questions as well. If you have a different view, please bring it in, because this is Iseropi is all about connection and bringing people together to have their views and their takes on it. As I said, we aren't medical professionals. We're coming over our we have some knowledge, or I would hope so. We have our knowledges and our personal things that we've learnt in our journey, but we come very much from a lived experience, as does the people in these comment sections. So please bring that in if you want to, and have any feedback or questions for us.
Absolutely. It's in that coming together and in that challenging that actually everybody learns. I learn every day, everybody learns every day. It's a good thing. All right, next question.
Before we go, a big hello to Alan, Sue and Sarah, who've joined us as well.
Very nice to have you. Very nice to have you. All right, so
on to the next.
The next question. What are some of the directions that you struggle with? So, I think this is an important one that we need to address, because we've already talked about the pervasive nature of how depression can affect us. And if you've got any comments this again, please share them. But for myself, I would say the very first thing that was affected when I started to tip into low mood and then consequently depression, friendships. My friendships were massively affected. I no longer felt like I had any self-worth, and from that, anxiety started to come up a little bit. And as I felt my anxiety, one of the first things to suffer was my friendships. I found myself disconnecting. I found myself deliberately not turning up to things. Avoidance became really big for me as well as a part of it. And that was the first thing to go. Further to that though, intimate relationships.
Yes.
I'd consider myself as having quite a healthy list of relationships before depression, but when I was really under the cosh of it, I had a good 6 years where I very deliberately took myself away from the relationship scene. Wasn't interested in the intimate side, because if I couldn't love myself, how could somebody else potentially love me? But it goes beyond that as well. My academia suffered. I stopped going to lectures. I stopped learning as much as I'd like. I had the opportunities for employment as well, which I was readily turning down. I think that encapsulates the key points for me. But anything for yourself, Jazz?
I think what directions I definitely struggled with, there was a few. So relationships was one of them. Relationships and trust. I wanted to be in a solitary kind of. I wanted to live in solitude. I just wanted to be alone. I didn't want to bother anybody. I didn't want to reach out. I just wanted to be alone. And I ended up kind of. It developed into really just that. I internalized it. I internalized that feeling of isolation, and I brought it into myself, and I used that to shame myself. which then in turn made me more depressed. Another area was addiction.
Oh.
I started to get so low that I wanted to find something that was going to help me, and avoidance was another one. I used my mood to really kind of avoid situations and not challenge myself at that time because I didn't feel that I possibly could.
Mm-hmm.
And it really fed into that kind of inner critic side as well.
Something very poignant that you were saying there is that effectively your internal feelings started to be represented in the world around you.
Yeah.
If we feel about ourselves a certain way, we start to walk a certain path, a self-fulfilling path, if you will. And it's about the way that we then start to act off the back of depression creates our reality around us as we disconnect, as we don't act in the way that we'd ultimately like. And then that's the cycle of depression. We just find ourselves tumbling into repeated cycles of destruction, ultimately.
There's a really good comment, I think you should bring it up.
I'd love that.
Sarah says, hi Sarah, Sarah says, I get really annoyed how some people trivialise depression. What I mean is if somebody feels normal fleeting sadness, they say they have depression. And it is a fair point. I think a lot of it's to do with language in that case.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
When I was in school, for example, it was either kind of sadness was just I've dropped something on the floor and I'm sad about it, like I've dropped my favourite cup. And depression was I've gone through something big. And that language has evolved over time. So I think it's a very valid point. And I think language comes into it so much in that the way we perceive what we say and the way we communicate what we say, and the experiences, the learnt behaviours and things that we've had growing up as well, what we've learnt, what we're associating things with, what we've researched as well. I was we always talk about not Googling your symptoms. It's a classic thing when it comes to health anxiety. And when you Google, I felt low for a certain amount of time, it says that you have depression or depressive disorders. And it can kind of add to that, can't it?
It certainly can. So it's interesting. I love that you use the word language there in particular because, quite frankly, in the English language, we don't have enough words sometimes to describe the lower spectrum of emotions. If we look to happy or the happy emotions, happy, ecstatic, joyous, buzzing, just a few words that came to my head immediately. But if you're feeling in that space, sadness, low, depressed. And depressed, because we don't have enough words for it, it's actually used to describe a whole spectrum of things that we feel. You might hear somebody, just go back to your pen analogy, you might drop a pen and you might say, oh, I'm feeling depressed. Really just off the bat. But it also just goes all the way to that other end, to the most extreme cases as well. I think it's a problem with the English language, certainly.
Definitely. Thank you though, Sarah. That's a really good point.
Really good.
Becky, hi Becky, it's brilliant to see you. Looking towards the future, long-term future goals, staying connected with friends and family, knowing your own potential and gifts that you have to give, how you feel about it, self-discipline always gets affected. That's fantastic. I think that's an answer to the question of what does depression look like in you, or kind of what is affected with depression. And it's really important that we notice that depression is so much, it affects so much more than just how happy or sad we are. Frankly, it affects a lot more stuff. It affects pain as well. Chronic, like any kind of fibromyalgia, chronic pain, these kind of things are massively affected by our emotions. And if we're lower, we're less likely to get our personal needs met. Therefore, we're less likely in turn to have our physical health in check or our kind of practical needs in check. Not for everybody, it's different for everybody, isn't it?
Well answered, well answered. I can see that we have another comment. I will say, just where we need to be mindful where it's a public live, we do need to be a little bit mindful of language, but the comment reads, I'm really miffed off because of depression. It's debilitating for those who suffer from it. It's a kick in the teeth for someone to throw the word depression around so loosely.
It's a good point.
It is a good point. I shan't lie, I find that somewhat frustrating a little bit as well from time to time. But I think we just have to sometimes work towards accepting the reality of the way things are at the minute. We have to recognise sometimes that other people might not have that same depth of knowledge as we do around the subject.
It's insight, isn't it?
It's insight.
It's the same way some people say, oh, I've cleaned the whole house today, I'm so OCD. Not recognising that is actually a debilitating condition that affects people and it changes people's lives. They just see it as as an expression term. It's how it's all been used by their friends and things like that. But it does trivialise real kind of deep conditions and real kind of things that people are really, really struggling with, and it does add to stigma as a result of that in some way.
It does, absolutely. But I think, like you said, it's something that's in progress. I think it's something that a lot of people are going to have that greater insight into in the coming years, especially through lives like this and just the way the culture is changing, thankfully. But yes, I think what we have to start to is just recognise we're not all there yet. That's okay.
And just to address, sorry about my language, don't worry about that, Sarah. It's less about, we can't read it out. That's the only thing. We will just bleep it out in our heads. You're more than likely to put language just as a little bit more appropriate than the big swear words. But we probably won't be able to read it. So we'll make a different word for it probably.
Absolutely. So, I've got a lot of depression in my family. Is that why I'm depressed?
I'm going to throw this over to you because this is where it really comes into stuff like the biopsychosocial model, isn't it?
It certainly goes into
I think
the
we've got
biopsychosocial model.
A graphic in the...
That's true. We won't use the graphic quite yet. I'd like to hold off on that.
Oh no, I like my graphics.
There's a certain amount of explanation that needs to come with it. So I've got a lot of depression in my family. Is that why I'm depressed? I'm going to give an immediate answer of maybe. But I would like to explore that a little bit more. Something that I think first needs to be understood. When people have depression running in their family, a lot of people might automatically start to think, oh, it's a genetic thing. It's something that because my parents have had it, because my grandparents had it, it's been passed down to me and now it lives inside of me. Quick fact, there is no such thing as the singular depressive gene. What I am saying by that is that we understand all of the human genome and there is no such thing that I share with Jazz and that I would share with the rest of the people that feel depressed as well. It is far more complicated than that. What we'll find is that there is an element of biological depression, and what I mean by biological depression is we're talking about chemical imbalances that perhaps might happen naturally, and that is a complex interplay of genes. But what happens a lot more often is that we find ourselves tumbling into depression, potentially because we've learnt to role model the people who had an influence on us as we were growing up, the way that they deal with things, their views on the world, and that can start to affect our mentality as well. Now, for the biopsychosocial model. The reason that I'd like to talk about the biopsychosocial model is because it's a wonderful model that helps to explain pretty much conclusively anybody's potential route into depression. What the biopsychosocial model proposes is that there is potentially a biological aspect to anybody feeling depressed. What we mean by biological is potentially that combination of complex genes. We might be looking at brain chemistry, so neurotransmitters like serotonin, endorphins, the roles that they might play in our mood. We could start to look to things like hormones as well. Hormones are really, really big in affecting our moods. It's worth recognizing. But beyond that as well, your age, if you've got any physical health conditions as well, we all know, we might recognize as well, there's a huge intertwining between your physical health and your mental health. The biopsychosocial model also proposes that there is a psychological component to depression. And what we are talking about with the psychological component is our mind, the way that sometimes our own internal narrative can start to shape the way that we interpret the world around us. If we find ourselves having a propensity for negative thinking, for instance, if we look at things negatively, we will then start to invite ourselves to feel negative, painful emotions. But going beyond that as well, not just thinking the expectations we set on ourselves, on the world around us, as well looking at where we put our meaning, how we attribute meaning to different things that have happened, where we put our focus and attention. Is it on that black spot or are we looking elsewhere as well? Because that's psychological. But also negative self-esteem beliefs come into psychological as well. Sometimes, or something that I recognise a lot with the people that I work with, is that there is this sometimes underlying feeling of not being worthy, not being good enough, not being okay. And then that can start to lead us into depression as well. And then finally, the last one that I want to mention, social, it says on here, sociological is another word for it. And that talks about the way that sometimes our environment, our routine, our circumstances can start to play a big role in affecting our mood. So this is a big one, because you mentioned it before, Jazz. You were talking about the way that sometimes grief can start to affect us. Coming back to that example, if I lost my job, my house, and my partner in the same day, I would naturally be feeling low because of the changes that have happened around me. Similarly, if I had a routine as well that didn't give me any connection to anything that really mattered to me, if I wasn't giving myself or feeling proud of myself on a daily basis because I wasn't going out into the world accomplishing the things that I want to do, I'd be feeling sad. Sadness is a natural human emotion, but sometimes the things that happen around us and the way that we live can prolong our stay in sadness. And there we have it. 3 different potential routes into mental health. Biological, genes, and brain chemistry in your body. We have psychological, your mind, the way that it interprets things, looking at that black spot or otherwise, and then the reality around you as well.
Biological rather, that also it talks about brain injury.
Brain injury, absolutely.
Brain injury. Alan at the top says, in the chat says, I was clinically dead for 6 minutes. Can this have caused my depression or at least contributed to it? I can't say, not a neurologist. However, there is a lot of links between the way our brains can be damaged when we die, and when we need to be resuscitated. There is a link between that and a certain amount of interference in the brain. It's personal for everybody. It's different. It affects people in different ways. Not sure about depression, but any kind of brain injury does tap into that biological side.
Certainly does, and I'm so glad you mentioned that. I actually have a personal friend that had some horrible brain trauma a few years ago, horrible accident, and they were absolutely fine in themselves, and now they suffer acutely with anxiety off the back of that. Not PTSD, strangely, but generalised anxiety. Head injury, brain injury, potentially can start to lead to that. So Alan, we're absolutely not saying that that is the case, but we're saying potentially.
And another thing is that you don't have to just go down one route. It can be a mixture of all things that can then create, or one or two things, or one thing that can create you as a person. As you said, I didn't put much value at all because I had a biological link to depression. That was the cause of my depression. I didn't put any importance on the social side, the learned experiences, my lived experience, the traumas, the situations that I'd gone through that had affected both the psychological side, but in my case, it was a very social side. And it's the value, in my case, it was the value I put on different types of depression. It was almost like I felt that in order to have true depression, it had to be biological, or it had to be because of a deep trauma.
No,
it couldn't be because I was homeless or had money situations or because I had a grief. It had to be because of these things. That was I used to put a lot of value on genetics and biology as a way of coping, I guess, as a way of disproving the fact that avoiding responsibility.
Well, that's it. Sometimes we can have a propensity to try and look for that biological reason to justify and take away that lack of ability that we might have to reshape it. But fundamentally, if our depression is biological, psychological, or sociological, we still have things that we can do.
Absolutely.
And that's the realisation I think that all of us will start to come to in our own time.
And they're still just as valid as each other, and just as and have just as much importance of getting support and getting kind of and using tools and accepting that in yourself as well.
That's it. All valid and all empowering as well.
Got a comment. I noticed. Hi Jeanette, by the way. I noticed my depression tends to be fine when I'm alone, but as soon as I'm around others for more than an hour, it seems to kick in. Thankfully, I have my phone and headphones to tell me elsewhere, but I actually like to spend time with people.
To some extent.
To some extent.
The rest of my family are all very social, so I don't quite understand why I am not. And
that's a good point about how depression and low mood and things like that can affect you in different situations. And it'd be interesting to see if anxiety has an element into that, because anxiety can then present as kind of isolated and withdrawn, but can then present similarly to depression symptoms. I know that when I was in, because I'm quite prone to a sensory overload. If I'm in a situation that's full of people, my brain shuts off. I want to withdraw automatically. My mood gets lower. I start to panic. Not so much now, but that's when I hadn't got a better handle on it. and it's almost like my social skills go out the window, and as a result my mood starts to look, and I start to judge myself, shame myself, guilt myself into trying to stick around, to the detriment of my mental health a little bit, in a way.
That's exactly it. And this is, this is where it starts to get a little bit complicated. Because fundamentally, for you, Jeanette, who's posted this comment, there's actually nothing wrong with being introverted. It's okay to want to spend time on your own, and sometimes we won't always understand why we might be different from our parents or different from other people in our lives. It isn't always something that needs to be understood, but it can be something that is celebrated. What I would make an argument for is, if Jeanette, if you feel that as a part of what you really want to do is to learn to socialise better, to be able to feel better around people, then it is absolutely valuable that you do keep going through that, but being mindful of spending time on your own, keeping your headphones with you, and it's much like any other skill. The more that you practice it, the more comfortable you'll feel, and in time, those kind of depression symptoms will start to alleviate.
Think of it like a sport. Think of it as something tangible. If you're training for a marathon, you have to ensure that we keep using marathons as our thing. Not everybody in Isopropia runs marathons. I certainly don't.
In fact, I don't think anybody does.
No, I don't think anybody does. But let's use that as a tangible example. If you're running a marathon and you're training for it, you need to ensure that you are having adequate breaks to self-care, to administer any kind of, if you have an injury or if you have any setback, that you're administering care to make sure that you can then go on with achieving that goal of running that marathon. And the same is for mental health. If you're in a situation where you're trying to push out of your comfort zone, being that it is an emotional thing and it is something that does create a lot of barriers in terms of your comfort zone, creates anxiety, that escalates and things like that. It's really important that you have your comfort things like headphones or something to help you to withdraw that situation if you have a setback in that situation, but also it's really important after you've done that to administer self-care, to make sure that you are calming yourself, grounding yourself, reflecting on it, and celebrating it for what it was, which is a massive success, even if there were setbacks.
Exactly, recognising the power of the steps that you've had to take in order to go through that, and just taking a moment to pause and to celebrate it. It's all a huge part of it. It really
but thank you for bringing that comment in.
Absolutely brilliant. Shall we mosey on to the next question?
Yes, we shall.
Very good. I've tried so many different meds. Why don't they work for me? Right, so medication. It's a controversial topic here.
Yes.
It is.
And I think before we start any kind of comments, it's good to say that we aren't medically trained, nor is that a part of our role. We don't have an opinion necessarily on medication because it is personal to everybody. Of course, we have our own personal views on our own personal things in regards to depression and medication, or medication in general. But this medication works differently for everybody. Some people really benefit from depression or need medication. Some people don't, and actually it's okay to have that difference of view and talk about that openly. In terms of medication, the first thing to mention is medication. There's so many different variables to medication where it becomes complicated. Dosage, time you take it, types of medication, and also the mindset you're in. If you're going into taking medication in the mindset that this is the only thing that's going to help me and I'm not going to have to do anything else but take the medication, it isn't going to work as effectively. Absolutely. Because it needs to be used in conjunction with other kind of coping mechanisms, CBT skills, or something that's, some kind of intervention that's going to work, that's practical intervention, social intervention. For example, your mood isn't going to lift if you're on antidepressants and going through a housing situation and you need to move house, but your fear of becoming homeless, until that situation is being dealt with and that anxiety side of it is being alleviated to a bit and you're getting support for that, or that situation has been resolved, the medication isn't going to just make you happy on the basis that you've taken that medication. You're also going to need to put the practical skills in place.
It kind of takes us back to that biopsychosocial model is what it does. Medication is entirely addressing the biological side.
Yes.
But we've already understood at this point that we're potentially more complex than that as human beings. And if we're realising, like you're saying, that the social side isn't sorted, you haven't got secure housing, you haven't got secure finances, you don't have meaningful relationships, or like you mentioned, CBT as well, if your thoughts are contributing to your issues and they're being left unaddressed, then perhaps you're only looking to help a small part of the overall package that needs addressing. It is worth mentioning though, medication doesn't work for some people, it does work for some people. And I've got a friend, a really close
Absolutely.
friend of mine that recently started a course of venlafaxine, and he's happy as Larry. Honestly, it's just an amazing thing to see that after all these years he's found something that really starts to
Medication can
work
be
for him.
life changing for some people,
Can
and
be.
that is absolutely fine. And I shouldn't. You should never feel ashamed for having to, have a course of medication or be on medication, because if it works for you and it's giving you a better quality of life, then it's no issue.
That's it. But medication, it can be the whole picture for some people, but a lot more often, what we will find is that it actually only represents a small amount, a small part of what it is that needs to change for us to work and manage around our depression.
And if we're not doing the things that are going to help the, one of my old nurse clinicians said this once, medication works its most effectively when the brain is primed to accept the chemicals that the medication's putting into it. So if you're not meeting those needs in terms of maybe basic human needs, your mindset, or physical activity, whatever that is, isolation, things like that, it's less likely to catch on and take hold into and to address those chemicals. But it can give you that little bit of a step up as well, that's going to help you to be able to do these things as well. So there is a controversy in terms of medication, but in general, if it works for you, it's good. But if it doesn't, that's okay as well.
Absolutely.
And there's more options out there.
There is.
Yeah.
Plenty of options. That's the good thing.
Yeah.
I think there are over 400 different models of therapies just to start. Again, therapy might not be the answer, but what it shows is the whole spectrum of things that need to be taken into account. Next question, I think. We have, why is having high expectations of yourself a bad thing? It makes me try harder. That seems like a good positive to me. Certainly the trying harder. But we need to be mindful of expectations.
Absolutely.
Again, I'm just going to refer back to that biopsychosocial model. Our expectations, the ones that we hold for ourselves and the world around us, are very much a psychological component. If we're setting high expectations and they're reasonable and we're achieving them quite often, then actually that's quite a good thing.
Yeah.
That can be a motivational thing. We can start to take pride as we soar higher and higher and higher in our careers or otherwise as we start to meet where we would like to go. However, we do need to make a clear distinction. If you have perfectionistic tendencies, or you have a habit of setting the bar too high beyond what is reasonably achievable by yourself, what you're actually doing is counterproductive. You are setting yourself up for your own internal feeling of failure.
Yeah, it's that achievement by shame type, where you can set where I set myself unrealistic, unreasonable expectations on myself to try and force myself to be what other people expected me to be, or to what I expected other people to expect of me. It was that I kind of, and by that I really just created a foundation of failure in myself, where I would not be able to meet these very high unrealistic expectations at the time, and I would then fail them because I wasn't able to achieve them, and by that result then I would be a failure and I wouldn't be able to achieve anything, and it just created this endless feedback between my brain and my motivation center. I don't know, that's not the word for it, but it wouldn't feed the motivation. In terms of setting expectations, it's adjustable as well. Some days the really unrealistic expectations that you had yesterday are very achievable today, and the next day they might not be. And having that kind of thing, that expectations are good to have, but they're also good to be, as you said, achievable and in your best interests as well, and also personal best interests.
That's it, the personal thing. They need to be a reflection of what it is that you want to achieve, Absolutely. Not what somebody else does. And this is an unfortunate fact that I see a lot, like I say, time and time again with people that come through our service, is that sometimes we can start to hold ourselves to other people's expectations. And you mentioned this, whether we're aware of it or not aware of it. As we go through life, we have a different combination of experiences. Some are good, some are bad, but what can effectively start to happen is if we're not shown unconditional love, if we're not valued for who we are as a unique human being, we can also start to try and attain an unrealistic, idealized sense of who it is that we should be. I think that sounded really quite complicated.
But in terms of unrealistic expectations that we get from others, that's a really good point, and this comment really does sum it up. I definitely enjoy being introverted, but it seems frowned upon. I get a lot done when I am alone, but I do want to settle down and have a family. Yet I can't stand being around people for long. And it does go back to that you were talking about being introverted, and the expectations of other people seems frowned upon. And the things that we enjoy, sometimes we can feel that because we're not doing things a certain way, to the way our families or our friends or the people, our peers, most likely do, that it's wrong. And actually, I'm quite introverted. I like my own space.
As am I.
I'm a full-grown adult who enjoys playing Lego, and that's frowned upon for some people because it's for children. But I enjoy it. I'm not going to be ashamed of that.
No, absolutely.
Actually, it's something that is giving me joy. It's giving me that time, and that's the most important thing. And just to remind yourself that if you enjoy it and it's not harming anybody, it's not wrong.
Yeah, it's absolutely not wrong. I think this is where we start to need to do that self-reflection to understand what are our own expectations, what is it okay for us to do for ourselves, playing Lego, perfect,
Yeah.
and what is it that we're trying to clamber towards, which is unrealistic and actually somebody else's business. I think that's a huge thing there. So what we start to understand already is that expectations, having realistic expectations of ourselves is a good thing, and this actually starts to point us towards the solution. That a lot of becoming well is understanding the small steps that we're going to need to take, not overreaching them, and actually starting to go through towards them with self-discipline.
That's a good bit of feedback as well. Best to set smart goals as they are more realistic. I don't have high expectations on anything, just go with the flow and praise the achievements I do every day. Absolutely. It's really important that you celebrate your successes when you make any of these kind of achievements. It helps to raise that mood. It helps to raise you out of that mood if you know that you're achieving things. But most importantly, you start getting a better sense of expectation management in yourself, positive self-talk. It will become a habitual thing. You're going to start to be able to see the good in things, which then in turn helps you raise your mood. By celebrating the small things, celebrating your victories, celebrating what you've achieved, it helps with the motivation, which then starts to it starts to set off, starts to help with your mood, it starts to help with your anxieties, it starts to really improve your overall well-being. If you take that time to accept positive feedback from yourself and from others, it also helps with accepting praise.
It does. It all builds
Thank you for bringing
towards
that in.
self-esteem and better well-being overall.
Absolutely.
Should we have a look at the next one?
Yeah, should we go to the next question?
We have. I know why I'm depressed. I've had a lot of bad relationships. Why do I keep putting myself in bad situations? So something that I want to be quite clear on here, and this is perhaps an unfortunate thing, is that sometimes we can start to fall into destructive patterns. A lot of it as well isn't necessarily our fault initially until we start to gain that awareness around the cycles that are going on. I kind of started to allude to this earlier. But a lot of the influences that we have in our early childhood and beyond that as well actually start to shape us as a human being. This is a quote that I heard a few months ago. I can't quite remember where from. I actually know it was Jim Rohn who said that you are, at any point in time, you are the sum of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. And what we can start to see is that if we've had a lot of role modelling from people who they themselves have had very poor patterns with relationships, we can then start to think that that's normal, that's okay. We can start to mimic the way that that's happened for people around us as well. And inadvertently, we can follow familial patterns, so we just keep putting ourselves back in the same situations. It's a tough one. It's a real tough one, but it's a cycle that potentially we can find ourselves in.
And also there is a positive in that comment that you have an awareness there. You have an insight into the patterns you're getting yourself into, and the first step to any kind of journey that you go on, any kind of changing behaviour, any kind of learning new skills or coping mechanisms, it comes down to insight and awareness. If you have that, the timing might be an issue, or the timing or the implementation or the self-discipline might self-discipline / motivation might be still a massive barrier, but just keep in mind that the insight you have there is going to really be helpful as well. and accepting and finding kind of specialised advice in terms of with kind of advice services and relationship services and things like that that are going to help you in finding and connecting with people who have similar experiences as well and how they dealt with it. So there's something to be said with having that awareness and insight as well.
Exactly. You're already recognising that you're putting yourself into that same pattern, and that's half the battle. Sometimes it is so hard to get people to realise and have the self-awareness of what's going on for them, but with that then comes empowerment. Like you say, kind of appropriate specialist help potentially, or otherwise starting to make deliberate choices which counteract those old patterns as well.
And specialist doesn't equal acuity. So specialism doesn't mean more intense. It just means that the support you're getting or the advice you're searching up on or the research you're doing for it or the tools you're searching up for are specialist to your situation. So relationships and poor relationships, it could be connecting with on the island women in white and engaging with the stuff in there if you're female. It could be more specialist and intense ones like DV and those kind of support services, but in general it's good to have good awareness.
Absolutely. All right,
should we go to the next question?
Absolutely.
I put myself down a lot. Why do I do this and others don't? And that comes a lot into positive self-talk, I think, and negative self-talk. We talk about this a lot about the inner critic. I think the inner critic is really a fascinating thing. But going into something a lot more kind of tangible in a way, we give ourselves feedback. Just as much as you hear negative feedback or hear positive feedback from other people, we do that to ourselves just internally. And if you continue to give yourself negative feedback, it becomes habitual in the same way being positive is. If you're used to getting negative feedback in your day-to-day lives, or if you've had an experience of that in the past, that can then internalise. If you're not meeting your expectations, that can then internalise into I'm failing or I'm doing something wrong here. If there's something that you don't agree with in yourself or you want to change about yourself, that can then turn into negative self-talk. And over time it just becomes habitual and we just do it automatically without thinking it. We think of the worst and what we've done wrong rather than what we've done right.
So it keeps coming back to that word habitual patterns is the thing. And again, what we're going to find is that even you can see this actually with twins as well. If twins who are born, they've got the same biology or broadly the same biology, they get separated, they have hugely different experiences in their life. They can then come together and actually have totally different personalities, totally different belief systems, and one of them might be a very positive person that holds that self-value and that self-love, and another person, based off the experiences that they've had, can sometimes find themselves going to that place of being self-critical, self-bullying. I'm worthless, I'm inadequate, I can't do this, I can't do that, I'm less worthwhile than the next person next to me.
Our organisational lead, Maria, gave me one really good bit of advice when it was addressing. I was absolutely shocking when it came to accepting praise. I wouldn't accept any kind of praise, and I certainly wouldn't think it was real, true. And she said to me, Jazz, if you can't accept it as it being true for yourself, just accept the praise on the basis that's what I believe. If you can't internalize it and use it to positive, to accept that praise and to administer positive self-talk for yourself, administer sounds a little bit medical, but we'll go with it. At least accept that that's my opinion of you, and that is a positive.
Trust the person who's saying it.
Yeah.
Trust
and
that they're being honest.
It helps you to take that small step out of that comfort zone if you need to break it down.
So to, I suppose, kind of conclude this question, a lot of it just comes from the past experiences that you've had. If you've been in patterns before where you haven't been able to love yourself, or you've had other people that have not accepted you or ostracised you, then you can start to genuinely believe for yourself that for whatever reason, you're not as worthwhile as other people. But then, like you were saying, Jazz, it comes that whole need for positive self-talk and be able to change that in a narrative as well. I'd like to have a look at the next question. And the next question says, when I'm feeling depressed, I spend all of my time sleeping. Is that normal? I'm going to go in straight away and say, yes, that absolutely can be normal. Is it productive? No. Is it potentially a part of the pattern that's keeping you low? Quite possibly, if not quite probably, is what I would say. What we are going to find is that when we're in the midst of depression, we are dealing a lot of the time with really overwhelming, painful negative emotions. What we will then start to find is that we build our routine again around trying to avoid having to feel these feelings that we've got. That's where our comfort zones might shrink. We might find ourselves avoiding friends, family, other situations which might bring around this pain. But what we'll also start to find is that as we adopt our routines, we start to create what I like to call control strategies. And a control strategy is any kind of self-destructive behavior that we start to do in order to avoid feeling emotion, suppressing our feelings, or compartmentalizing our feelings as well. And sleep, for me, or oversleeping, is effectively a way that we can start to avoid that sadness, that inner pain. If we are fundamentally asleep, we don't have to feel. But it doesn't necessarily just stop at sleeping as well. I'm sure we'll have some relatable things here as well, but there are so many different ways that we can start to avoid having to feel and to suppress our emotions, which are ultimately, you'll have heard this before possibly, but self-destructive.
And also, quite simply, overwhelming emotions is it takes up energy. In the same way, doing any kind of mental arithmetic or any kind of mental process, it takes energy, and if it's overwhelming, your brain is at some point going to become tired. If it keeps draining that energy from you, you're going to get tired from it. And it does come into that kind of the coping mechanisms that we use and the coping strategies that we build over time. Mine was eating. You know, eating was a massive one for me. Drugs was another one for me, and they kind of, sleeping is a very common one because it's very, very accessible. Yeah. Or you can just fall asleep.
That's it.
And but other people have the opposite, that they can't fall asleep. So there's sleeping problems can kind of arise quite a lot.
So, like you were saying, they're sleeping. Just to give another list, again, drugs was also one for me. We're talking about things like excessive gaming can be another way, because you get to escape into another world. It gives you that immediate gratification. We can look at gambling can be a thing as well. We can look at promiscuity. Self-harm starts to come into this as well, because that offers a sense of emotional release, is what it does. Overeating, undereating can also be a huge thing. And all of it is to try and give us this sense of control, to just avoid having to feel. The issue is that with a lot of these things, they don't actually help the underlying problem. All they're doing is avoiding something that is then going to resurface later down the line and possibly be a bigger monster to have to deal with. But also it just offers that short-term get through it. It leaves us feeling worse in the long run, because we start to feel guilt, shame towards the way that we've done that as well. So, what have we got here, Jazz?
I've got a comment from Jason. Hi, Jason. He says, I sometimes find myself looking forward to when I can go to bed and then disappointed when I wake up again.
And again, for yourself, Jason, I wouldn't want to prescribe to say that this is the case, but it could potentially be because there is an element of you that is either tired with the day's affairs of having to go through certain trials and tribulations, and then bed can be an attractive prospect. It doesn't mean that you're struggling with depression necessarily. I get that after a hard day. It gets to about 5 o'clock, and then I'm thinking, I kind of wish I could go to bed now. I'm tired, I'm exhausted.
It's a brilliant reflection to bring in that you can wake up the next morning going, and it can happen for a number of reasons, all the way from the simplest thing of I don't want to go up and get up and go to work. This happens, but also it can be I don't know what to do here. I don't know how to go on with the day. I don't know what today is going to lead for me. What's the point? And these questions can start to come up in droves. There's a good reflection, and it's a good thing to investigate in yourself. A thought diary might be good. Keeping a tag on, what might be a pattern that's being created when you wake up. Is it something the night before that's similar to another experience you've had where you've woken up and felt the same way? And actually, when you've woken up and gone, this is my day, I'm really ready and roll for the day, what did you do the night before?
That's it. It's investigating with kindness, is what it is.
There's another comment as well. It's this one here. How do you actually do positive self-love when you've been told all your life that you're useless and people will leave you?
I've got a suggestion.
Mm.
I mean, you've gone for one already, which was trusting in the good comments that other people give you. Not trusting in the words themselves, but trusting that they're well intentioned and that they believe that to be true.
Yes.
But another one that I always like to start off, and this is the first thing that I had to do when I started to go through my journey of empowerment, is I was encouraged to write a strengths list. So a strengths list is a very simple list of some of the good values or qualities that you recognise that you have. Full disclosure, this can be hard work, and I know that for myself I was able to touch on, I think it was 2 strengths that I recognised that I had. I recognised that I was quite bright academically, and I recognised that I did care. I did care immensely. It was a very short list. But what is a really nice thing that we can start to do around this to recognise our own value? Every time that you recognise that you're feeling a sense of accomplishment, you take a step. For instance, like Jeanette was saying, she goes to a social event, she feels uncomfortable, but she accomplishes that. What you can then do is you can pause, reflect on what does that mean that you had to be able to get through that. So for instance, if I were to go to a social event and I were to stick it out, although I was feeling anxious and spend time with my friends, I might actually recognise that I am quite determined. And that's a strength.
Yeah, absolutely.
Add that to your list. And then what you can do over a period of time, every time that you recognise you're having a success or accomplishment, add to that list, refer back to it, and that is an undeniable list that you're left with of the values that you have.
A lot of things involve writing it down.
Yeah.
Writing it down is very good for memory, and if it's because it's physical, because it's tangible as well, it helps you to make something more habitual. So I'm very glad that it's now become trendy to write gratitude diaries and gratitude lists.
That's a good idea.
Gratitude lists are very helpful in the fact that it gets you into that positive mindset, and it helps you to sit back and express what you're grateful for, and to celebrate, and also to, I always write my successes down. What have I succeeded in? And look in that as a more positive outlet, as what can I do tomorrow, or what do I need to, or actually having a more healthy mindset in terms of, okay, I didn't get this done that I wanted to, rather than feeling bad about it, how can I break it down to make this more achievable? And it helps us to start to feed back more positively to ourselves, and get more positive mindset and positive feedback, almost feedbacks, as a habitual thing that we do daily, which we then don't need to write them down physically because we're kind of doing them on our own.
You can do it in your head, and absolutely to that end, I always keep a little black book with me, and in that I constantly, or a lot more so in the past, I used to write down all of these kind of similar thought patterns, analysing what does that mean that I am. But it's something that becomes habitual. I now barely write in this, but I still carry it with me because it's something that I want to lean on should I need it.
Yeah.
But it's all very, very useful.
I think.
Sorry, go for it, Jazz.
We've got 2 questions left. So this is I've been in a cycle of depression for years now. What can I do to get out?
Right. So I will give a very brief answer on this because I'm aware that we've only got perhaps a couple of minutes to go. But what we can start to do is we can start to look towards the biopsychosocial model again, to be able to understand what some of the things that we might be able to do are to better manage our depression. If we think that we're struggling with biological depression, what we can look to do is to potentially look to medication. It's not the be-all and end-all, that's quite a passive solution, but what we want to start to look to do is to manage any physical health conditions that we've got, but also then start to work towards rebalancing our neurotransmitters, our brain chemistries, our hormones, and a lot of this stuff we can do, thankfully, quite actively. We need to look to start taking care of our basic needs. So we need to look to address our sleep. We need to look to address the things that we're putting into our body, food and nutrition. We also need to start to look towards managing exercise as well. And if exercise were a pill, it'd be one of the most cost-effective drugs ever invented. We need to consider these active ways of managing. Psychologically, positive self-talk, stepping outside of our comfort zone, starting to change that in a narrative as we take pride and accomplishment in pushing ourselves out there, but also working towards self-acceptance of who it is that we are as an individual.
And that brings on to this question as well.
Ooh.
Onto, I keep taking 2 steps forwards and 3 steps back. Do others feel like that? Yes. And when we're setting these expectations on ourselves, that it's important to be come into it with a lack of judgment in our own personal lives. We're going to be able to achieve different things at different rates, in different mindsets, ourselves as well as other people, comparing yourselves to yourselves, celebrating the changes in your mindset that you would have been different or more negative, quote unquote, or less productive 3 or 4 months ago when you started doing this work on yourself. Remembering that we're all unique individuals who all have different experiences and process things in different ways, and that isn't something we need to be ashamed of, but it doesn't mean we can't do anything about it. It's just about that reaching out and taking that step. Medication might be one, reaching out to support services like Iseropia might be one, and engaging with people and being honest and open with people who you trust as well, is so important. I think that's a really good one to leave on as well. Yeah. Is that feeling of actually don't judge yourself, or try not to judge yourself when you get into these mindsets, and go, look, I'm feeling this way right now. I can move on from there. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. There is something better over the horizon. I just need the right conditions in which to do so. How can I get those conditions? What needs do I need to be met?
That's exactly it. Keep taking those steps forward, and do recognise that the progress that is made is not lost. It might feel like 3 steps back, but I can promise you that you haven't forgotten the great steps that you've taken in that direction as well. What we will do is we're going to wrap it up here for now. Absolutely. I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure hosting you all today. I really hope that you've enjoyed the content. If you guys would like to join us again, we will not be doing a live next week, I'm afraid to say, but we will be doing another public live on Friday the 19th?
It will be the 18th.
No, Friday the 18th of June. We'll be doing another live at exactly the same time. So if you guys would like to join us then, that'd be absolutely fantastic. And in the meantime, if you've connected with anything that we've said, or you'd like to have a little go at getting some additional support, please don't hesitate to start to seek a referral to our service as well. It's been a pleasure.
I'm going to leave you this comment. Celebrate your uniqueness and learn not to compare yourself to others. We are all on our journeys in life, and we can relate and sympathise with others.
What a wonderful note to end on.
Absolutely. See you later, everybody. Take
care.
very good care, and
Bye.
we'll see you in a couple